She had one job that night: surprise her husband on their anniversary. Instead, she surprised herself. Diane Whitmore stood behind a wall of frosted glass on the 14th floor, watching her husband get down on one knee for another woman. She had rehearsed this night for 3 weeks. A candlelit table booked under his name. A song they had danced to at their wedding, cued and ready. A card in her purse that she had rewritten 4 times, because she wanted the words to be exactly right. She had driven across town in her good coat and her good shoes to surprise her husband, Mark Whitmore, on the night of their 15th wedding anniversary. Instead, she watched him open a small black box in front of his boss, and she heard him say the 2 words she had been waiting 15 years to hear directed at her. He said them to someone else. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a woman ends up frozen behind a glass wall, watching her husband propose to another woman, you have to go back to the beginning, because nothing about Mark and Diane's story looked like it was heading here. They had not always been complicated. They had once been simple, in the way that only 2 people who genuinely liked each other could be. Diane wanted 3 big questions answered by the end of this story, and she suspected the viewer would want them too. How long had this actually been going on? Did the woman on the other side of that glass know Mark was married? And what, exactly, was Diane going to do with what she now knew? Those questions would take her the better part of a year to answer, and every answer would cost her something. Mark and Diane met in their late 20s at a mutual friend's housewarming party, back when Mark was still driving a used sedan with a check engine light that never turned off, and Diane was 3 years into a career she was still figuring out how to love. He was funny in a self-deprecating way that made people underestimate how sharp he actually was, and she was direct in a way that made people either love her instantly or take a little while to warm up. They talked for 4 hours at that party without noticing the time, and Mark called her the next morning before noon, which she later told her sister was the first sign that he was serious about her, because in her experience the men worth keeping were the ones who didn't play games about when to call. Their courtship was ordinary in the best sense of the word. Dinners that ran long because neither of them wanted to be the one to end the night first. A road trip along the coast that turned into an argument about directions and then into one of their favorite shared memories. Meeting each other's families, surviving those awkward holiday dinners where everyone is on their best behavior, and coming out the other side more certain rather than less. Mark proposed on a beach in North Carolina 2 years after they met, badly, nervously, dropping the ring in the sand and laughing about it for the rest of their marriage. A story they told at nearly every dinner party for over a decade because it never stopped being funny to both of them. Their wedding, a modest afternoon ceremony at a lakeside venue neither family could quite afford but somehow paid for anyway, was the kind of day people still brought up years later as one of the warmest they'd attended. Diane's father, a quiet man who rarely gave speeches, stood up during the reception and told the room that he'd never seen his daughter laugh as easily with anyone as she did with Mark, a line Diane kept written on a card in her nightstand drawer for the entirety of their marriage. Mark's mother, for her part, had pulled Diane aside before the ceremony and told her, only half joking, that her son had a tendency to disappear into his own ambitions when he felt insecure, and that the trick to keeping him steady was making sure he always felt like enough at home. Diane would think back on that piece of advice many times in the years that followed, long before she understood how much weight it would eventually carry. They built a life the way most couples do, in small, unremarkable increments. A starter apartment with a leaking faucet neither of them knew how to fix. A first house that took every bit of savings they had and felt, for the first year, like it might swallow them whole in mortgage payments. A dog named Biscuit who outlived 2 of Mark's jobs and 1 of Diane's cars. There were ordinary hardships along the way. A miscarriage in their 4th year of marriage that neither of them talked about much afterward, but that Diane always felt had quietly reshaped the architecture of their relationship. A stretch of unemployment for Mark in their 7th year that tested them both in ways they hadn't expected. They came through those years leaning on each other, and Diane remembered those years as good years, not perfect, but good, the kind of good that made her believe they had built something sturdy enough to survive whatever came next. What came next was Vanessa Ross. Mark had been climbing steadily in his career for over a decade, moving from account manager to regional director through a combination of genuine talent and a willingness to work harder than almost anyone else in the building. 3 years ago, the company underwent a leadership shakeup, and a newly appointed chief executive was brought in from outside to modernize a firm that had grown stagnant under its previous leadership. That executive was Vanessa Ross, and within her first 6 months, she had reorganized half the department structure, including moving Mark into a role that reported to her directly. Diane remembered Mark coming home the week of the announcement, genuinely excited, telling her this was the kind of opportunity that could define the next decade of his career, and Diane remembered being happy for him, because she had watched him work hard for exactly this kind of chance for years. Vanessa was, by every account inside the company, brilliant, demanding, and relentless, the kind of executive who answered emails at midnight and expected roughly the same level of availability from the people closest to her. She had a reputation, even before she arrived, for being difficult to work for, but nearly impossible not to respect, the kind of leader whose approval people quietly competed for even when they complained about her privately in the break room. Diane remembered meeting her exactly once, at a company holiday party roughly 2 years ago, a brief conversation over a glass of wine near the appetizer table. Vanessa had been polished, articulate, and warm in the specific way that powerful people are warm when they want something from you. Though at the time Diane had no reason to suspect that what Vanessa might eventually want had anything to do with her husband. What Diane remembered most clearly from that one meeting, in hindsight, was the way Vanessa had looked at Mark when she spoke to him, a kind of attention that lingered a half-second too long, an intensity that Diane noticed and then dismissed almost in the same breath. Diane told herself it was nothing. Executives paid close attention to people they valued professionally, and Mark was, by every measure, one of Vanessa's most valuable people, the one she pulled into high-stakes meetings, the one whose opinion she solicited in front of the rest of the leadership team. Diane told herself that was simply how ambition looked from the outside, a mentor investing in a promising protege, and she went home that night thinking nothing more of it, filing the interaction away in the part of her mind reserved for things that don't matter. The changes came slowly enough that Diane could explain each one away individually, even as they accumulated into something she could no longer ignore. Mark's hours got longer, but his job had always been demanding, especially since the promotion, so that tracked easily with everything she already understood about his career. He started taking calls from the car, in the driveway, after he had already parked, sitting outside their own house for 10 or 15 minutes at a time before coming in, which struck her as odd only later, in hindsight, once she had reason to look back and question it. He began dressing a little differently for work, small things, a new watch he said was a gift to himself after a big quarter, a haircut more frequent than his usual schedule. None of it, on its own, meant anything. All of it, together, would eventually mean everything. There was a company summer retreat roughly 7 months before the anniversary, a weekend event for senior staff and their spouses at a lakeside resort a few hours outside the city, one of the few work functions Diane had actually been invited to attend alongside Mark. She remembered, looking back, a moment during the closing dinner when Vanessa had stood to give a short speech about the team's performance that year, and had paused, mid-sentence, to find Mark's eyes across the room before finishing her thought, a small gesture Diane hadn't registered as significant at the time. She remembered, too, that Mark had seemed unusually tense that entire weekend, quicker to excuse himself for phone calls, quieter than usual during the drive home. She'd chalked it up to the general exhaustion of mixing work obligations with a weekend that was supposed to feel like a getaway, never once considering that the tension she sensed in him might have had nothing to do with work at all. Roughly 3 weeks into her private investigation, once she suspected there was more to find than credit card statements alone could tell her, Diane discovered that a family location-sharing app they'd both installed years earlier, mostly for keeping track of each other during long solo drives, was still quietly active on both of their phones. Scrolling back through months of location history she'd never once thought to check, she found a pattern of stops at an address she didn't recognize. Always on evenings Mark had told her he was working late, always for windows of time too long to be a quick errand. She looked up the address out of a kind of grim curiosity and found it belonged to a small, discreet apartment building roughly 15 minutes from Mark's office, the kind of building that existed, she realized with a fresh wave of nausea, for exactly this purpose. Their anniversary dinner reservation itself, made months in advance at the restaurant where he had proposed 15 years earlier, got quietly moved twice in the weeks leading up to the actual date, both times for what Mark called an emergency board meeting tied to a major client account. Diane remembered feeling a small flicker of irritation each time, the kind any spouse feels when a special occasion gets pushed aside for work. But she also remembered telling herself that this was simply the cost of being married to someone ambitious, someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Diane did not confront him about any of it as the pattern built, not because she was naive or unobservant, but because she trusted him completely, and trust, she would later realize, was doing a tremendous amount of quiet, invisible work in that marriage that no one had thought to check on in years. Looking back, Diane could identify a dozen small moments in the months before that anniversary that, individually, meant nothing, but that formed, together, the outline of something she had refused to see. A perfume she didn't recognize on one of his jackets, which he explained away as someone brushing past him in a crowded elevator. A hotel key card left in his coat pocket from a city he'd told her he hadn't traveled to that month, which he explained as a work trip he'd simply forgotten to mention. A new lock screen on his phone, something he'd never bothered with in 15 years of marriage. Diane had noticed every one of these things in the moment they happened, filed each one away individually, and moved on, because taken alone, none of them proved anything, and she had built her entire adult life on the assumption that her husband did not lie to her about the things that mattered. The night of the anniversary itself started the way she had planned it for weeks. She left work early, picked up the dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, a deep green that Mark had once told her was his favorite color on her, and drove to the restaurant with genuine excitement, the kind she hadn't quite felt in years, buoyed by the sense that this anniversary might be the one that reminded them both why they'd started in the first place. She arrived 10 minutes early and sat at the bar with a glass of wine, checking her phone periodically, watching the reservation time come and go. 30 minutes after they were supposed to be seated, she received a text from Mark, apologizing, saying he was stuck at the office and it might run late, the same explanation he had given twice before in the weeks leading up to this exact night. Something in her, some small and stubborn part of her that 15 years of marriage had not fully quieted, decided she was not going to sit alone at a table for two while her husband worked late on their anniversary for the third time in a month. She decided to surprise him instead, to bring the celebration to him rather than wait passively for him to remember her. She paid for her wine, gathered the gift bag she'd left in the car, and drove across town toward his office building with something like hopeful determination, imagining the look on his face when she walked in with the card and the small gift she'd chosen for him, a watch to replace the one he'd been wearing since before they were married. She had no idea, driving across town with a gift bag on the passenger seat, that she was about to walk into the ending of her marriage instead of the middle of it. The office building was unusually quiet when she arrived, the lobby half-lit. A security guard who recognized her and waved her through without a second thought, because she had been there so many times before over the years that she was practically part of the furniture, someone who'd brought Mark lunch during deadline crunches, someone who'd waited in that same lobby for holiday parties and after-work dinners more times than she could count. She took the elevator to the 14th floor, the executive floor, where Mark's office sat 2 doors down from Vanessa's corner suite, a floor she rarely visited but knew well enough from company events. She noticed, stepping off the elevator, that the assistant's desk near the entrance was empty, unusual for a weekday evening when someone was typically still finishing up. She noticed the lights in the main hallway had been dimmed, not off, but dimmed, the way a space gets dimmed when someone wants a particular kind of atmosphere rather than simply saving on electricity after hours. She told herself it was nothing, that offices sometimes dimmed their lights automatically after a certain hour, and she kept walking toward Mark's office with a gift bag in one hand and a card in the other, her heels quiet against the carpet, her mind still running through the small speech she'd prepared in the car. She passed a conference room she recognized from company meetings, its glass walls dark, and then slowed as she approached the stretch of hallway that led toward both Mark's office and Vanessa's corner suite. There was a warmth to the light spilling from Vanessa's office that the rest of the floor didn't have. Candlelight, she would realize a moment later, an odd detail for a corporate office at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night. one that should have struck her as strange immediately, but that her mind simply hadn't caught up to yet. She never made it to Mark's office door. Through the frosted glass wall that separated the hallway from Vanessa's suite, she saw two shapes, one standing, one kneeling, and for a moment her mind simply refused to process what her eyes were showing her, running through a half-dozen more innocent explanations before settling, finally and completely, on the one that was true. Then Mark's voice, muffled but unmistakable, carried through the glass, and she heard him say words she had spent 15 years waiting to hear him say to her. Words about forever, words about finally being ready, words she had once imagined hearing on a beach in North Carolina rather than through a pane of frosted office glass on a Tuesday night that was supposed to belong to her. Diane did not walk in. She did not call out his name, did not throw open the door, did not do any of the things she would later imagine, in quieter moments, that another version of herself might have done. She stood perfectly still in that dim hallway, gift bag still in hand, and she waited, listening to the muffled sound of a conversation she had no right to be hearing and every right in the world to hear, because some instinct told her that what she did in the next 60 seconds mattered more than anything she had done in the last 15 years. She heard Vanessa's voice next, quieter, harder to make out through the glass, but unmistakably warm, unmistakably moved. The voice of someone saying yes to a question she had clearly been hoping to be asked. What Diane did instead of confronting them that night was something that would come to define the entire year that followed. She turned around, walked back to the elevator on legs that felt disconnected from the rest of her, and made it to her car in the parking garage before the shaking started, sitting behind the wheel for nearly 20 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. She drove home in silence, the radio off, the gift bag still sitting in the passenger seat, where she had placed it hours earlier with an entirely different set of expectations. By the time Mark returned that night, hours later, with some story about a client emergency that had run unexpectedly long, Diane was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, and she looked at her husband, and she said nothing at all about what she had seen. That decision, to say nothing that first night, was not one Diane fully understood herself in the moment. Some part of her worried that confronting him immediately, in the raw heat of what she'd just witnessed, would give him the chance to construct an explanation before she had gathered any evidence beyond her own eyes and ears. Another part of her, the part she was less proud of, simply wasn't ready to hear whatever he might say, wasn't ready to have the conversation that would end her marriage before she'd had any time at all to prepare for it. She told herself she needed one night to think, and one night became a week, and a week became the beginning of a much longer investigation that she hadn't consciously decided to begin, but that she found herself conducting anyway, almost against her own will. Over the following weeks, Diane began the quiet, methodical process of learning the truth about her own marriage, a process that felt at times like investigating a stranger rather than the man she had shared a bed with for 15 years. She went through old credit card statements first, ones that had always come to a joint account she rarely scrutinized closely, looking now with new eyes for charges that didn't match the explanations she'd been given at the time. She found hotel charges tied to conferences and cities Mark had traveled to for work, charges that, when she cross-referenced them against the company's public event calendar, lined up suspiciously well with cities Vanessa had also been scheduled to visit for the same stretch of dates. She found restaurant charges on nights Mark had told her he was working late at the office, restaurants she'd never been to, restaurants that, when she looked them up, were the kind of quiet, expensive places designed for exactly the sort of dinner that didn't want to be seen. She checked his calendar next, a shared work calendar he'd set up years earlier, so she could see his availability when planning family events, and found entries labeled with client names for meetings that, when she quietly asked a friend who still worked in Mark's department, belonged to no client Mark had ever actually worked with. The friend, a woman named Carol who had known Diane for nearly a decade, hesitated when Diane pressed for details, and that hesitation told Diane almost as much as anything Carol eventually said out loud. Carol admitted, reluctantly, that there had been office rumors for months, nothing anyone had confirmed, nothing anyone felt comfortable repeating directly to Diane, but rumors nonetheless, about Mark and Vanessa spending an unusual amount of time together outside of standard meetings, about the two of them leaving events together, about a closeness that had started to draw quiet attention from people who worked near them every day. Carol also told her something that landed harder than any of the rest of it, which was that at least two other people in the department had noticed the same pattern months earlier and had quietly agreed among themselves not to say anything, partly out of loyalty to Mark and partly out of a simple, human reluctance to be the one who blew up someone else's marriage based on a hunch. Diane sat with that for a long time after Carol left, turning over the idea that an entire small circle of people at Mark's office had, in some sense, been watching this unfold in real time while she remained the only person who didn't know. It wasn't Carol's fault, and Diane never blamed her for it. But it added a new layer to the betrayal, the sense that her private life had quietly become an open secret in a building she had once felt entirely comfortable walking into unannounced. There was a night, roughly 5 weeks into her quiet investigation, when Diane very nearly abandoned the plan entirely and confronted Mark on the spot. He had come home late again, later than usual, and something about the practiced ease of his explanation, the way the lie slid out of him without a single hitch, made her want to put every piece of evidence on the table right then and demand he explain himself immediately. She stood in the kitchen with her phone in her hand, the message thread already pulled up, her thumb hovering over his name. She didn't send anything that night. She told herself, again, that she needed the full picture before she gave him any warning at all, and she went to bed instead, lying awake beside a man she now understood she barely knew, rehearsing a confrontation that was still weeks away from actually happening. The most damning discovery came almost by accident. On a Saturday morning, when Mark had left his phone unlocked and charging on the kitchen counter while he showered, something that had never mattered before because Diane had never once thought to check it. A notification appeared on the screen from a messaging app, a single-line preview from a contact saved simply as V, and Diane, her hands unsteady, opened the thread and found a conversation that stretched back much further than she had feared, all the way back to a leadership retreat nearly 11 months earlier. The very same week Mark had told Diane he'd be unreachable due to spotty cell service in the mountains. She sat at the kitchen counter and read every message she could find before the shower shut off, then read them again once Mark left for a run later that afternoon, searching for the exact moment the two of them had crossed a line, and found instead that there hadn't been a single moment. There had been a slow, deliberate erosion, one late-night conversation at a time, over the better part of a year. For a brief and disorienting stretch of days, Diane actually suspected the wrong person entirely. An earlier round of digging through Mark's email had turned up a warm, familiar exchange with a woman named Jill from a vendor company Mark's team worked with regularly, and Diane spent nearly a week convinced that Jill was the other woman, going so far as to look up her social media profile late at night, comparing photographs, building an entire narrative around a relationship that turned out to be nothing more than an old college friendship Mark had simply never mentioned. She felt almost foolish once the real thread with Vanessa surfaced properly, but she also recognized, looking back, that the false trail had served a purpose she hadn't expected, forcing her to practice, in a lower-stakes way, the exact kind of careful, evidence-based thinking she would need once she found the truth that actually mattered. Diane also went back, during that stretch, and looked again at photographs from the one company holiday party where she'd met Vanessa in person, scrolling through images on her phone from a night she'd once considered entirely unremarkable. In one photograph, taken by a colleague and shared in a group chat afterward, Vanessa stood slightly too close to Mark near the bar, her hand resting briefly on his arm in a way that, at the time, had registered as nothing more than friendly. Looking at it now, with everything she knew, Diane felt an entirely different chill looking at that same photograph, a reminder that the truth had likely been visible all along, captured accidentally in the background of 100 ordinary moments she simply hadn't known to look at closely. The picture that emerged over the following weeks was more calculated than Diane had allowed herself to imagine in that first hazy week after the proposal. This was not, as she initially wanted to believe, a man who had stumbled into an affair in a single moment of weakness at a conference far from home. There were hotel charges tied to at least 4 separate trips over the past year, 3 of which lined up precisely with Vanessa's own travel schedule according to the company's internal announcements. There were calendar entries stretching back nearly the entire 11 months, carefully labeled to withstand casual scrutiny, each one a small, deliberate lie constructed to protect a much larger one. And there was that text thread, hundreds of messages long by the time Diane finished reading through it in full, charting a relationship that had moved from professional respect to something considerably more personal, with a patience and deliberateness that unsettled Diane more than a single reckless mistake ever could have. Diane also learned something in those messages she had not expected to learn, something that complicated the story in a way she wasn't fully prepared for. Vanessa Ross was not, as Diane had initially assumed in her angriest moments, a woman knowingly and cynically pursuing a married man for the thrill of it. In an email exchange Diane found buried in an old shared drive from a joint project the two of them had worked on years earlier, back before any of this began, Vanessa had once referenced Mark's marriage directly, in a professional context, congratulating him warmly on an anniversary Diane herself remembered celebrating at the time. Which meant, at some point in the months that followed, Mark had told Vanessa a story about his marriage that no longer matched reality, a story convenient enough, generous enough to himself, to let Vanessa believe whatever she needed to believe in order to move forward with him in something resembling good conscience. Diane found, scrolling further back through the messages, moments where Vanessa had asked directly, plainly, whether Mark was truly separated the way he'd told her, whether there was anything unresolved she should know about before things between them went any further, and moments where Mark had reassured her, in language too specific and too practiced to be spontaneous, that his marriage had been over in every way that mattered for a long time, that Diane and he were simply staying under the same roof for practical reasons that would resolve themselves soon. Reading those exchanges, Diane realized she was not the only one who had been managed, not the only one who had been fed a version of events carefully engineered to keep her exactly where Mark wanted her, while he built an entirely separate life running parallel to the one she thought they still shared. Diane did not go through those weeks entirely alone, though for a long time she wanted to. She eventually told her older sister, Patricia, who had been skeptical of Mark's ambition long before any of this began, and who listened without saying the words Diane half expected to hear, the quiet told you so that never actually came. Patricia became the one person Diane could call late at night, when the weight of pretending everything was normal at the dinner table became too heavy to carry alone. She also began seeing a therapist during those weeks, not to process the affair itself, since she hadn't yet confronted Mark and wasn't ready to name it out loud even to a professional, but simply to have 1 hour a week where she didn't have to perform composure for anyone, where she could say plainly that her marriage felt like it was collapsing and she didn't yet know why she was allowed to feel that way. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened almost 8 weeks after that night on the 14th floor, longer than Diane had originally planned, but she had wanted every piece of evidence organized and undeniable before she gave Mark any opportunity to shape the narrative in his favor. She sat him down at their kitchen table on a Sunday evening, the same table where they had once addressed wedding invitations by hand years earlier, the same table where they'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners, and she laid out what she knew, piece by piece, methodically, watching his face change with each new detail she produced. She started with the night on the 14th floor itself, watching the color drain slowly from his face as he realized she had known, all along, for 2 full months, while he continued coming home each night pretending nothing had changed. What struck Diane most in that conversation was not, ultimately, his confession, which came reluctantly and in pieces rather than all at once. It was his justification, offered almost as though he expected her to eventually understand and perhaps even forgive the reasoning behind it. He spoke about feeling unseen for years, about a slow accumulation of resentment neither of them had ever properly addressed, about a version of ambition and possibility Diane had never fully understood or supported in his telling of it. He talked about Vanessa representing a life that felt, in his own words, more alive than the one he had built at home, a life where he felt seen in a way he claimed he hadn't felt in years. Diane sat and listened to her husband explain, in careful and clearly rehearsed language, why the last 15 years had apparently not been enough for him, and she realized, somewhere in the middle of his explanation, that she was no longer angry in the way she had expected to be. She was simply, completely done. At one point in that first conversation, Diane slid the printed pages of the message thread across the table, watching Mark's eyes move down the page as he recognized his own words reflected back at him in black and white. He tried, briefly, to argue that context was missing, that certain messages had been taken out of sequence, before seeming to realize how hollow that argument sounded even to himself, and trailing off mid-sentence. Diane didn't raise her voice once during that entire conversation, a fact she was quietly proud of afterward, because she had promised herself in the weeks leading up to it that she would not give him the chance to later describe her as hysterical or unreasonable, a small, deliberate act of control in a night that had otherwise stripped her of nearly everything else she thought she understood about her own life. That first conversation was not the only one they had that week. Over the following 4 nights, Mark tried repeatedly to reopen the discussion, sometimes with anger, insisting Diane was making him out to be worse than he was, and sometimes with a kind of desperate softness, reminding her of the 15 years, of Biscuit, of the life they'd built, asking whether all of it could really be erased by one mistake he swore, unconvincingly, had only just begun. Diane found those conversations harder in some ways than the first one, because each time he reached for the good years, some small part of her wanted to reach back, and each time she had to remind herself, deliberately, of the 11 months of messages, the calendar entries, the hotel charges, the entire architecture of a lie that had clearly taken far more effort to build than a single mistake ever could have. By the end of that week, Mark asked her directly whether there was any version of this where she would consider staying, and Diane realized, answering him, that she had already made her decision somewhere in that hallway on the 14th floor, long before she ever said a word to him about what she'd seen. She told him she wasn't interested in trying to rebuild something on top of a foundation she now knew had been cracked for the better part of a year, and that the version of trust required for a marriage like theirs simply couldn't be manufactured twice. Mark moved into a hotel 3 days later, and the house, for the first time in 15 years, belonged to Diane alone. Roughly 4 months after he moved out, Mark reached out again, this time by letter rather than in person, a handwritten note that arrived at the house on a Tuesday, and that Diane read standing at the mailbox before she'd even made it back inside. He wrote that losing his job had given him more time than he knew what to do with, time he'd spent, in his telling, finally understanding how badly he'd damaged the one relationship in his life that had actually been solid. He asked, carefully, whether she would consider meeting him for coffee, not to discuss reconciliation necessarily, but simply to talk, man to woman, without lawyers or documentation between them. Diane sat with that letter for nearly 2 weeks before deciding not to respond to it at all, concluding that whatever closure Mark was hoping to find in that meeting was his responsibility to find on his own, and not hers to provide for him a second time. What happened next was not the quiet, dignified separation that people sometimes imagine when a long marriage ends behind closed doors. Diane, methodical by nature and newly unwilling to protect the people who had not protected her, brought her documentation not just to a divorce attorney, but eventually to the company's board of directors as well, since the relationship between Mark and Vanessa, a direct report, and the chief executive who supervised him, violated the firm's own written policy on conflicts of interest and workplace relationships between executives and the employees who reported to them. Diane had not initially set out to involve the company at all, but the more she learned about how deliberately the relationship had been concealed from colleagues and how it had potentially influenced decisions within Mark's reporting chain, the more she felt that silence would simply be protecting the two of them one final time, in a way she was no longer willing to do. The fallout was swift once the matter became one for the board rather than a private betrayal contained within 2 families. Vanessa, whose ascent to chief executive had made her one of the most closely watched leaders in the company's recent history, was placed on administrative leave within days of the board receiving Diane's documentation, and resigned less than a month later under a cloud of scrutiny she had spent her entire career carefully trying to avoid. The company's public statement was brief and carefully worded, citing a mutual decision and a desire to pursue other opportunities, language that fooled almost no one inside the building who had already heard some version of the story circulating through the office grapevine. Mark's own position, tied closely to Vanessa's leadership and to a reporting structure that no longer existed once she was gone, did not survive the restructuring that followed either, and he found himself unemployed for the first time in over a decade, at the exact moment his personal life was also unraveling completely. The board's internal investigation, which Diane participated in as a witness rather than an employee, uncovered more than she had brought them initially. Human Resources interviewed several people in Mark's department, including Carol, and the picture that emerged inside the company matched almost exactly the picture Diane had already assembled at her own kitchen table, a relationship that had shaped at least 2 promotion decisions in ways that had quietly disadvantaged other employees who never knew they were competing on an uneven field. That detail, once it became part of the official record, made it considerably harder for Mark to find comparable work afterward, since word within their fairly small industry traveled faster than either he or Vanessa had likely anticipated when they first believed they could keep the relationship contained. Diane herself was asked to give a formal statement as part of that internal investigation, sitting across from 2 members of the Human Resources team and an outside attorney the board had brought in to ensure the process was handled properly. She hadn't expected how exhausting it would feel to narrate the entire timeline out loud to strangers. Watching them take careful notes as she described the 14th floor, the credit card statements, the location history, each detail landing in that sterile conference room with a weight it hadn't carried quite the same way when it lived only in her own head. She left that meeting feeling strangely hollowed out, less like a wronged spouse and more like a witness in a case that had somehow absorbed her entire personal life as evidence. And she sat in her car in the parking garage afterward for a long while before she felt steady enough to drive home. Mark's job search stretched on for the better part of 8 months, complicated by a reference history that had quietly gone cold and by an industry where, it turned out, a great many people had already heard some version of what happened. He eventually took a role well below his previous title, at a smaller company willing to overlook the circumstances, and Diane heard through mutual friends that he had moved into a modest apartment across town, a considerable step down from the life he had once described to Vanessa as something he was eager to leave behind. Diane did not take satisfaction in hearing this, not exactly, but she also didn't feel the sympathy she might once have expected herself to feel, and she noticed, with some surprise, how little either reaction seemed to matter to her by that point. For Diane, the ending of her marriage was not a single dramatic scene, but a slow unwinding of a life she had spent 15 years building, room by room, decision by decision, box by box, as she eventually packed up a house that no longer felt entirely like her own. The divorce settlement took the better part of a year to finalize, complicated significantly by the assets they had accumulated together over a decade and a half, and by Mark's suddenly diminished financial position after losing both his role and much of his professional reputation within their industry. There were mediation sessions that stretched for hours, arguments over furniture that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with 15 years of accumulated grief, and long stretches of silence between them that felt, to Diane, far heavier than any of the shouting matches she had once imagined a divorce might involve. One particular mediation session, roughly midway through the process, nearly collapsed entirely over a disagreement about a set of dishes Diane's grandmother had left her, an argument that on its surface had nothing to do with the marriage's larger wounds, but that both attorneys later admitted, privately, was really about something neither Mark nor Diane could quite say out loud in that room. Diane's attorney, a measured woman named Ruth who had handled dozens of divorces over her career, told Diane afterward that in her experience, the fights that seemed smallest were often standing in for the ones nobody could bring themselves to have directly, and that the dishes were never really about the dishes at all. Mark eventually conceded the point without much further argument, and Diane always suspected, though she never asked, that some quiet remainder of guilt had made the fight not worth having. Diane ran into Vanessa exactly once during that year, entirely by accident, in the parking lot of a grocery store roughly 10 minutes from the house Diane still lived in. Vanessa looked, for a moment, as though she might turn and walk the other way, and then seemed to decide against it, approaching Diane instead with an expression that carried something Diane hadn't expected to see, which was genuine, uncomplicated remorse. Vanessa told her, briefly, that she hadn't known the full truth of Mark's marriage until far later than she should have, and that she was sorry, sincerely, for the part she had played in it, however much or little that accounted for. Diane didn't offer forgiveness in that parking lot, and didn't feel she owed it, but she also didn't feel the urge to say anything cruel, and the two women parted with a short nod that felt, to Diane, like the closing of a door rather than the opening of one. Diane later heard, through the same web of mutual acquaintances that seemed to carry every piece of news back to her eventually, that Vanessa had relocated out of state within the year, taking a considerably smaller leadership role at a company far removed from the industry circles where her name had once carried so much weight. Diane felt no particular satisfaction in that news either, the way she once imagined she might, and instead found herself thinking, briefly, about how thoroughly one closed-door decision on a Tuesday evening had rearranged 3 entire lives, sending each of them down a path none of them had been walking 6 months earlier. It was a strange thing, she told her sister once, to feel almost nothing where she had once expected to feel triumph. And Patricia had simply told her that was what healing actually looked like, quieter and less dramatic than anyone ever expects it to be going in. Diane kept the house in the end, along with Biscuit, the dog who had outlived 2 of Mark's jobs and was now, in his old age, the one steady presence remaining from the life she had known. She also kept something else she had not expected to walk away with, which was a hard-won clarity about exactly how much of herself she had spent over the years trying to be enough for someone who had, somewhere along the way, and likely long before that 14th floor, quietly stopped counting the ways she already was. She did not get the apology that might have satisfied some part of her that still, even now, wanted one, because she came to understand over time that no apology built after the fact could fully undo the better part of a year spent constructing a careful, deliberate deception. What she got instead was the truth, in its entirety, uncomfortable and complete, and she made a decision, somewhere in that difficult year, that the truth would simply have to be enough. More than a year removed from that night on the 14th floor, Diane's life looks considerably different than she once expected it to at this stage. She repainted the kitchen a color Mark had always vetoed, took up the pottery class she'd talked about for a decade without ever finding the time, and reconnected with a circle of college friends she'd drifted from during the busiest years of her marriage. She still works the same job she always has, still walks Biscuit around the same block every evening, and still lives in the same house, but she describes the shape of her days now as fuller in a way she didn't anticipate, as though a room she hadn't realized was locked had quietly opened back up. She isn't dating yet, and says she isn't in any hurry to, preferring instead to spend this stretch of her life becoming reacquainted with the version of herself that existed before she spent so many years organizing everything around someone else's ambitions. Diane still thinks, sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and Biscuit is asleep at the foot of her bed, about that 60 seconds behind the frosted glass wall, the moment she chose silence over confrontation, patience over impulse, in what may have been the single most consequential decision of her adult life. She has come to believe it was, in fact, the most important decision she made in the entire ordeal, because it gave her the space and the time to uncover the whole truth rather than reacting only to the single piece of it she happened to witness that night. She has also come to believe, with the strange clarity that only distance can provide, that the version of Mark she married all those years ago and the version of Mark who knelt on that carpet in front of Vanessa were, in some fundamental sense, the same person all along, simply a person she had never before been given sufficient reason to fully see. Whether that realization makes what happened to her more forgivable or considerably less forgivable, Diane still isn't entirely sure, even now, well over a year removed from that night. Some days she feels a strange, distant compassion for the man she married, understanding on some level how a person can drift so far from who they promised to be without ever consciously deciding to. Other days, particularly the harder ones, she feels only the cold clarity of everything she now knows he was capable of hiding for the better part of a year, while sleeping beside her every single night. What she is genuinely certain of, on every single one of those days, good or bad, is that she would rather carry the full and uncomfortable truth about 15 years of her life than spend one more single day protecting a lie that was never really hers to protect in the first place. So we'll leave you with the same question Diane still asks herself on the harder nights, the question that started this entire story on that 14th floor. If you had been standing behind that glass wall, watching everything Diane watched, Would you have walked in immediately and confronted them right there in front of everyone? Or would you have done exactly what Diane did and waited and gathered the truth before you let anyone know what you'd seen? Let us know in the comments below what you think you would have done in her exact position, and if this story kept you watching all the way to this very last moment. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one, because the next story we're about to bring you might be even harder to believe than this one.